Get down. On your knees. Now. The officer's voice thundered through the peaceful morning air, shattering the stillness like glass crashing onto concrete. The man stopped mid-step, his breath catching in his throat. He turned slowly, his hands raised in instinctive surrender as confusion clouded his face. He had been jogging. That's all, just jogging through the park, clearing his head before the day began. And now, he was staring down the barrel of a nightmare. I said down. The officer's boots crunched against the gravel path as he stepped closer, his hand already resting on his holster. Don't make me say it again. The man's heart pounded in his ears, but he didn't move. His voice was steady, though his pulse raced. What's the problem, officer? The officer's eyes narrowed, scanning him from head to toe, lingering on the sweat-soaked t-shirt and faded jogging pants. You know damn well what the problem is, he spat. You're trespassing. Suspicious behavior in a public park. We've had reports. The man frowned. I was jogging. Jogging? The officer barked a laugh, his hand tightening around the grip of his weapon. You expect me to believe that? A guy like you hanging around here? In this neighborhood? Dressed like that? Looks more like you're casing the place. People started to gather at the edges of the park. A couple walking their dog slowed their pace. A teenager pulled out her phone and hit record. But no one stepped in. No one said a word. Sir, the man began, his voice calm but firm. You're making a mistake, the only mistake I see is you not following my orders. The officer lunged forward, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back. Pain flared through his shoulder as he stumbled. I'm not resisting, he said, gritting his teeth. The officer didn't care. He shoved him harder, forcing him onto his knees. Stop resisting. Hey, someone called out. He didn't do anything. Stay out of it, the officer snapped, his voice sharp enough to cut through the protests. This man fits the description we've been given. Now, everyone back off and let me do my job. The man felt the dirt press into his palms as he tried to steady himself. Humiliation burned in his chest. The whispers, the stares, they all weighed on him. But the worst part was the officer's voice. That tone. That sneer. You don't belong here, the officer said, leaning in close enough that his words felt like venom dripping into his ear. Men like you never do. Something inside the man snapped. He clenched his jaw, swallowing the rage that rose in his throat. You need to let me go. The officer laughed, a sharp, cruel sound. Oh, do I? And what makes you think you can give me orders? The man slowly rose to his feet, the tension thick enough to choke on. He straightened his shoulders, brushed the dirt from his knees, and met the officer's eyes. I think you're making the biggest mistake of your career, he said. The officer's smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he shoved him again. You think you're somebody important? The man didn't flinch. His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, a sharpness that cut through the officer's bravado. I don't think, the man said, staring him down. I know. Yeah. The officer crossed his arms, his smirk returning. Who the hell do you think you are? The man reached into his pocket. The officer tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. But the man didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out a badge. The officer's face paled. You just assaulted the chief of the FBI, the man said, his voice steady and unshaken. The silence was deafening. The crowd froze. The officer's eyes darted from the badge to the man's face, disbelief flooding his expression. No, he muttered, shaking his head. No, that can't be, the man held the badge higher. I suggest you call your supervisor, he said, his voice hard and unrelenting. Immediately. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Phones zoomed in. Cameras clicked. And the officer's hands began to tremble. But this wasn't the end. Not even close. Because the humiliation the officer inflicted was only the beginning. And what happened next? It left everyone speechless. At Plough of Twist, we firmly stand against racism and discrimination in any form. We believe in equality, justice, and respect for all individuals, regardless of race, gender, or background. This channel is a safe space where stories are told to inspire, empower, and spark important conversations. If you've ever faced injustice or discrimination, know that you are seen, heard, and valued. Your story matters. Now, sit back, relax, and get ready for an emotional and powerful story that will leave you thinking long after it ends. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support our work. Enjoy the story. It was one of those mornings where the air felt heavier than usual, carrying with it the weight of expectation and unspoken tension. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the neatly trimmed grass of the city park. Birds chirped lazily, and the faint sound of joggers' feet pounding against the pavement echoed in the distance. For most, it was just another ordinary morning. But for Malcolm Hayes, it was a rare moment of stillness, one that he had desperately needed. Malcolm wasn't the kind of man who blended into the background. At 6 feet 2 inches, his broad shoulders and sharp jawline commanded attention even when he tried to go unnoticed. His skin, the color of polished mahogany, gleamed under the soft morning light, and his eyes, dark and steady, betrayed a quiet confidence that often made people second-guess themselves before speaking in his presence. But here, in a pair of worn-out jogging pants and a simple gray t-shirt, Malcolm looked like any other man trying to clear his thoughts before the chaos of the day began. He wasn't always this composed. It had taken years of hard work, sacrifices, and late nights to get to where he was. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, Malcolm had learned early on that survival wasn't guaranteed. He had seen friends get swallowed up by the streets, victims of bad choices or bad luck. His mother, Angela, had done everything she could to keep him on the right path, working double shifts as a nurse and still finding time to push him to excel in school. She used to remind him every night before bed, "You're not defined by where you come from, Malcolm. You're defined by what you do with where you come from." Those words had stuck with him, echoing in his head during the hardest moments of his life. They pushed him through college, through law school, and later, through the grueling years climbing the ranks in the FBI. Now, at 38 years old, Malcolm was one of the youngest chiefs the agency had ever appointed, a fact he kept close to his chest. Titles had never mattered much to him. It was the work that mattered, the chance to make real changes from the inside. But today, none of that mattered. Today, he was just a man trying to catch his breath. The park was quiet, except for the occasional chatter of dog walkers and parents pushing strollers. Malcolm paused near a wooden bench to stretch, glancing around at the serenity of it all. It reminded him of how far he had come. And yet, no matter how many titles he earned or accolades he received, there were always reminders, small, sharp jabs from the world around him, that told him he was still seen as less. He tried not to dwell on it, but the memories were always there. He bent down to retie his shoe, his fingers moving quickly, and that's when he heard the voice. "Hey! You! Stand up and step away from the bench." Malcolm froze, his muscles tensing instinctively. The voice was sharp, authoritative, and filled with something he recognized immediately, suspicion. He stood slowly, turning to face the source of the command. The officer, Ethan Crowley, stood with his hand resting on his holster. He was tall and lean, with sharp features and a buzzed haircut that made his pale skin seem even more severe. His uniform was crisp, and his badge gleamed under the sunlight. But it was the look in his eyes that Malcolm noticed first, that look he'd seen too many times before. "What's the problem, officer?" Malcolm asked, keeping his voice steady. "You're the problem," Crowley snapped, stepping closer. "What are you doing here?" Malcolm blinked, momentarily stunned by the aggression in his tone. I'm jogging. Jogging? Crowley repeated, his lips curling into a sneer. In this neighborhood? Dressed like that? Don't play games with me. Malcolm felt the heat rising in his chest but forced himself to stay calm. I didn't realize jogging required a dress code. Watch your tone, Crowley barked, taking another step forward. I asked you a question, and I expect an answer. Malcolm opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Crowley grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. Stop resisting. Crowley yelled, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. Malcolm gritted his teeth as pain shot up his shoulder. I'm not resisting. Get down. Crowley kicked the back of Malcolm's knee, forcing him to drop to the ground. Gravel dug into Malcolm's palms as he braced himself. Hey, a voice called out from the crowd that had started to gather. What's he doing? He didn't do anything. Stay back. Crowley barked, his voice trembling slightly now as the phones came out. People were recording, but it didn't stop him. You don't belong here, Crowley hissed under his breath, leaning close to Malcolm's ear. Men like you never do. Malcolm's hands clenched into fists. He felt the anger rising, threatening to boil over, but he swallowed it down. Not yet. Crowley yanked him back to his feet, shoving him hard enough to make him stumble. You think you can just walk through this park like you own the place? Malcolm steadied himself and looked Crowley in the eye. For the first time, the officer hesitated. Malcolm straightened his shoulders, brushed the dirt off his clothes, and spoke with the calm authority that had taken him years to master. You're making a mistake, Malcolm said. Crowley laughed, but it was forced now, the bravado slipping. Oh yeah? And who the hell do you think you are? Malcolm didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket, slowly, deliberately, as the crowd watched in stunned silence. He pulled out his badge and held it up. The chief of the FBI, he said. Crowley's face drained of color. The crowd erupted in whispers, phones zooming in closer. No, Crowley muttered, stepping back. No, that's not possible. Malcolm didn't move. Call your supervisor, he said. Right now. But this was only the beginning. Because what happened next? It was something no one saw coming. Crowley's hands trembled as he stared at the badge, his eyes darting between the golden emblem and the steady, unwavering gaze of the man holding it. Beads of sweat formed on his brow, and the color drained from his face as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. His breathing quickened, shallow and uneven, as if he were struggling to hold on to the authority that was slipping through his fingers. But there was something else in his expression too, something darker. It wasn't just fear. It was defiance, a desperate attempt to keep control of a situation that had spiraled far beyond his grasp. Malcolm didn't flinch. He held the badge higher, letting the sunlight catch its polished surface, making sure the crowd, still recording, still murmuring, could see it clearly. The whispers grew louder. People leaned in closer. Phones zoomed in, capturing every detail of Crowley's expression as his confidence crumbled. You're lying, Crowley said, his voice low and sharp, but it lacked the force it had moments ago. You're bluffing. That can't be real. Call your supervisor, Malcolm said, his voice calm but cutting. Right now. Crowley's jaw clenched, and his eyes flickered toward the crowd. The weight of their stares pressed down on him, the dozens of phones pointed at his face like weapons he couldn't defend against. He reached for his radio, hesitating for just a moment before pressing the button. Dispatch, this is Officer Crowley, he said, his voice tight. I need a supervisor at my location. Immediate response. The words hung in the air, and Malcolm saw the shift in Crowley's posture. The cocky arrogance was gone, replaced by rigid tension and barely concealed panic. The crowd didn't miss it either. They whispered to one another, their voices laced with disbelief and anger. Malcolm stood his ground, his eyes locked on Crowley's. He could feel the energy of the crowd changing, building like a wave that hadn't yet crested. He knew it was only a matter of time before the situation exploded, but he wasn't going to let it happen on Crowley's terms. "You think this ends here?" Crowley muttered, so low that only Malcolm could hear. His voice was sharp, but there was an edge of desperation underneath it. "You think flashing a badge changes anything?" Malcolm's expression didn't waver. "What just happened is going to cost you more than you realize," he said, his voice steady. Crowley opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of tires crunching on gravel cut him off. Heads turned as a black and white police SUV pulled up. The door opened, and Captain Ross Garrett stepped out. Garrett was a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a deep furrow in his brow. His uniform was immaculate, but his eyes betrayed a weariness that spoke of too many years spent in the trenches. Malcolm recognized him immediately. He'd reviewed Garrett's file before, seen the commendations for bravery alongside the complaints for excessive force. Garrett was the kind of man who knew how to keep things quiet, how to protect his own. Garrett's eyes scanned the scene quickly, assessing the situation with practiced precision. He lingered on the crowd, the phones, and finally, Malcolm. His gaze flickered to Crowley, and for a moment, Malcolm saw something in Garrett's expression, disappointment, maybe even frustration. "What's going on here?" Garrett asked, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Crowley straightened, his shoulders snapping back as if the presence of his superior gave him new confidence. "This man resisted an order and became aggressive," he said quickly. "I had to take control of the situation." Malcolm stepped forward, holding up his badge again. "I'm Malcolm Hayes, Chief of the FBI's Criminal Division," he said, his voice firm. "And your officer assaulted me without cause." Garrett's face paled. He reached out, taking the badge and examining it closely before handing it back. His jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully measured. "Chief Hayes," Garrett said. "I didn't realize." "No," Malcolm interrupted. "You didn't." Crowley's face flushed, but he wasn't ready to give up. "Captain, I didn't know who he was," he said quickly. "He didn't identify himself," Malcolm cut him off. "I didn't need to identify myself to jog in a public park. I didn't need to identify myself to stand up for my rights when your officer decided to treat me like a criminal." The crowd stirred, their whispers growing louder. Garrett glanced nervously at the phones pointed at him, clearly aware of how bad the situation looked. "We'll handle this," Garrett said, lowering his voice. "Let's step aside and discuss." "No," Malcolm said sharply. "We're not stepping aside. Not this time." Garrett's eyes snapped to him. "Chief Hayes, I understand you're upset, but we need to de-escalate." "You want to de-escalate?" Malcolm said, stepping closer. "Then start by admitting what happened here. Your officer assaulted me without cause, humiliated me, and tried to intimidate me into submission. And now you're scrambling to cover it up." Garrett's face hardened. "That's not what's happening." "It is," Malcolm said, cutting him off again. "And you know it." Crowley finally snapped. "This isn't fair," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I was doing my job." Malcolm turned to him, his eyes cold. "Your job," he said. "Was it your job to throw me to the ground? To assume I was guilty without evidence? Or was it your job to make sure the people you're supposed to protect feel unsafe in their own communities?" Crowley's face turned red, and his lips twitched like he wanted to respond but didn't know how. "I know enough," Malcolm said before Crowley could speak. "And I know this isn't over." Garrett stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Chief Hayes, we'll conduct a full investigation." "You're damn right you will," Malcolm said, stepping even closer. "But you won't be leading it." "I will." The crowd erupted, voices shouting, phones flashing. Crowley's face fell, and Garrett's shoulders stiffened. Malcolm could see the panic behind their eyes. Crowley's voice dropped to a whisper, venom lacing his words. "You're making a mistake. And if I go down, I'm not going down alone. Malcolm didn't respond. He turned and walked away, his mind already racing. He knew this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. And what came next? It was going to change everything. Malcolm stood in the dimly lit conference room, his reflection staring back at him through the glass window that overlooked the city skyline. The tension in the room was suffocating. Across the table, Captain Ross Garrett and Officer Ethan Crowley sat with rigid shoulders, their eyes betraying the nervousness they were trying so hard to hide. Malcolm didn't sit. He remained standing, letting the weight of his silence fill the room. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the ticking of the clock mounted on the wall. Garrett cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Chief Hayes," he began, his voice measured, careful, like a man stepping onto thin ice. "I think we can all agree that this situation has gotten out of hand." Emotions were high. "Stop," Malcolm said, his voice sharp and cutting. Garrett froze. Malcolm's eyes locked onto his, unflinching. "Don't insult me by trying to downplay what happened. This isn't about emotions. This is about accountability." Crowley shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of the table. Malcolm turned to him, his expression hardening. "You haven't said a word since you walked in here. That's surprising, considering how loud you were when you had my face in the dirt." Crowley's jaw tightened, and for the first time, his composure cracked. "You don't know what it's like out there," he snapped. "You sit behind a desk and give orders, but you don't know what it's like to be on the ground, dealing with real threats, making split-second decisions, real threats." Malcolm interrupted, stepping closer. "What threat did I pose? Was it the sweatpants? The jogging shoes? Or was it the color of my skin?" Crowley opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He looked at Garrett as if searching for backup, but Garrett said nothing. Malcolm let the silence hang there, letting the weight of the question linger before continuing. "You want to talk about decisions? Fine. Let's talk about them. You decided to judge me before I even opened my mouth. You decided I was a threat before I even had the chance to prove otherwise. And then, when you realized you'd made a mistake, you doubled down instead of admitting it. That's not instinct, Officer Crowley. That's arrogance. And it's dangerous." Crowley's face turned red, and he slammed his fist on the table. "I didn't know who you were." Malcolm didn't flinch. "And that's the problem," he said. "Because it shouldn't have mattered who I was. It shouldn't have taken a badge for you to see me as a human being." Garrett finally spoke up, his voice low and deliberate. "Chief Hayes, we're prepared to offer a formal apology. Crowley will be suspended pending an internal investigation, and will." "No," Malcolm said, cutting him off. "A suspension isn't enough. Not for this." Garrett's eyes narrowed. "What are you asking for?" Malcolm leaned forward, planting his hands on the table. "I want him fired. And I want an independent investigation into your department's practices. This isn't just about one officer. This is about the culture you've allowed to thrive under your leadership." Garrett's face hardened. "You're overstepping." "No," Malcolm said, his voice steady. "I'm doing my job. The same way you were supposed to do yours." Crowley stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is a witch hunt," he said, his voice shaking. "You're using your position to ruin my career." Malcolm stepped back, letting Crowley's words hang in the air. "You ruined your own career the moment you decided to abuse your authority. All I'm doing is making sure you don't get to do it again." Crowley's hands clenched into fists, but before he could speak, the door opened. A woman stepped in, holding a folder. She handed it to Malcolm without a word and left just as quickly as she had entered. Malcolm opened it, scanning the pages before looking back at Crowley and Garrett. "This," Malcolm said, holding up the folder, "is a report detailing multiple complaints against Officer Crowley for misconduct, excessive force, and racial profiling. Complaints that were conveniently buried under mountains of paperwork and quietly dismissed. Garrett paled, and Crowley's eyes widened. "That's not true," Crowley stammered. "Those complaints were unfounded." "Were they?" Malcolm said, flipping through the pages. "Because what I see here is a pattern. A pattern that ends today." Garrett leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You need to be careful, Hayes. You're making enemies right now. Powerful ones." Malcolm met his eyes, unflinching. "The only people who should be afraid are the ones who let this happen. And if that includes you, Captain Garrett, then so be it." Crowley lunged forward, pointing a finger at Malcolm. "You think this is over? You think you can walk in here and destroy everything I've worked for?" Malcolm didn't move. "I don't have to destroy you, Officer Crowley. You did that all by yourself." Crowley's face contorted with rage, but Garrett grabbed his arm, pulling him back down into his chair. Malcolm closed the folder and straightened his tie. "I'll be filing formal charges," he said. "And you can expect federal oversight in your department from this point forward. Consider this your first and last warning." He turned to leave, but Crowley's voice stopped him. "You'll regret this." Malcolm paused, his hand on the door. "The only thing I regret," he said, turning back to face them, "is that it took this long for someone to hold you accountable." And with that, he walked out, leaving them sitting in stunned silence as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. But Malcolm knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. The storm was just beginning. Malcolm stood at the edge of the lobby, his eyes fixed on the double glass doors that separated him from the outside world. The voices of the crowd buzzed faintly through the glass, muffled but growing louder with every passing second. Cameras flashed, their bright bursts of light cutting through the dimness of the lobby. Protesters held signs, and reporters jostled for position, microphones stretched high, waiting for him to step outside. But Malcolm didn't move. Not yet. Behind him, the tension hung thick in the air. The sharp click of footsteps echoed against the marble floors, and Malcolm turned just in time to see Captain Garrett approach, his expression strained, his eyes locked on Malcolm with a mixture of frustration and desperation. Crowley lingered a few steps behind him, his shoulders hunched and his face pale, as if he were already mourning the life he knew was slipping away. Garrett stopped a few feet away, keeping his voice low. "Hayes, you need to think about this," he said, his tone calm but urgent. "You walk out those doors, and you're making this public. Once it's out there, there's no coming back. Whatever leverage you think you have now, you lose it the moment you hand this story over to the media." Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't move at all. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his eyes sharp as they cut into Garrett's. "You think I care about leverage?" Malcolm said, his voice quiet but steady. "This isn't about leverage. This is about accountability. Something your department doesn't seem to understand." Garrett's face tightened, and Malcolm saw the flicker of panic behind his eyes. "You have no idea what you're stepping into," Garrett said, his voice dropping lower. "You think this is about one bad cop? One incident? You think Crowley's the only one who's going to take the fall for this? You're wrong. If you push this, it's going to pull everyone down with it, including you." Malcolm took a step closer, his voice hardening. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Garrett's jaw clenched. "No, it's supposed to warn you. You start this, and people are going to dig into everything. Your past. Your record. Every decision you've ever made. They're not going to care about the truth. They're going to care about the headlines. And when they're done tearing you apart, do you really think anyone's going to remember what Crowley did?" Malcolm's eyes narrowed. "You think this is about protecting myself," he said, his voice sharp now. "You think I don't know what's at stake? I've spent my entire life walking this line, Garrett. I've had to prove myself every single day, prove that I belonged, that I deserved the position I earned, that I wasn't just some quota hire. And even after all that, even after everything I've accomplished, I still ended up face down in the dirt because someone like Crowley decided I didn't look like I belonged. So don't stand there and lecture me about consequences. I've been living with them my entire life. Garrett didn't respond. He didn't need to. Malcolm could see it in his eyes, the fight draining out of him. But Crowley wasn't done. "You're destroying me," Crowley said suddenly, his voice raw and shaky as he stepped forward. "You're destroying my career. My family. Do you have any idea what you're doing? Do you even care?" Malcolm turned slowly, his expression unreadable as he faced Crowley. "Do I care?" he repeated, his voice low. "You want to talk about caring? Where was your care when you shoved me to the ground? When you humiliated me in front of a crowd of strangers? When you looked at me and saw nothing but a threat?" Crowley's eyes flickered, and Malcolm saw the cracks beginning to form, the panic, the guilt, the fear. "I didn't know who you were," Crowley said, his voice breaking. Malcolm stepped closer, his voice rising. "And that's the point. It shouldn't have mattered who I was. It shouldn't have taken a badge to make you stop. You want me to care about your career? Your reputation? What about mine? What about every person who didn't have the power to stand up to you? Did you care about them?" Crowley's face flushed red, and his fists clenched at his sides. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice cracking. "I made a mistake, okay? But I'm not a bad person." Malcolm's voice dropped, and the room fell so quiet that Crowley's breathing sounded deafening. "You don't get to decide that," Malcolm said. "Not anymore." Crowley opened his mouth to respond, but Malcolm cut him off. "You spent your whole career hiding behind that badge, using it like a shield to justify everything you did. But today, that shield broke. And now? Now you're just another man who finally has to face the consequences of his actions." Crowley's shoulders sagged, and Malcolm saw it, the moment the fight left him. The moment he realized there was no coming back from this. But Malcolm didn't look away. He let Crowley sit in the weight of his failure, let him feel every ounce of the shame and regret he had spent years pushing onto others. Garrett stepped forward, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "We can fix this," he said. "We can make this right. But not like this. Don't let your anger drive this. You're better than that." Malcolm's eyes locked onto his. "This isn't about anger," Malcolm said. "It's about justice. And if you can't see the difference, then you're part of the problem." Garrett didn't respond. He just stepped back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Malcolm turned without another word and pushed through the doors. The crowd erupted the moment he stepped outside. Reporters shouted questions, microphones were shoved toward him, and flashes of light blinded him from every direction. But Malcolm didn't stop. He raised the folder in his hand and held it high. "This," he said, his voice carrying over the noise, "is the beginning of change." The crowd roared, and for the first time since the nightmare began, Malcolm felt something shift. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger than that. And as he looked out at the faces in the crowd, faces filled with hope, anger, determination, he knew this fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. Malcolm stood outside the precinct, the weight of the folder still firm in his grip as the crowd slowly began to settle. The initial roar of voices had given way to murmurs, questions hanging in the air like fog. Reporters circled closer, but Malcolm didn't move. He let the weight of their stares press against him, his expression unreadable. Cameras flashed, microphones hovered near his face, and questions shot out from every direction, sharp, desperate, demanding. But Malcolm ignored them. His eyes were fixed on the glass doors behind him, where Garrett and Crowley still lingered in the shadows, their silhouettes distorted by the reflection of the crowd. The tension hadn't left Malcolm's body, not entirely. It buzzed just beneath the surface, a hum that refused to die down even as the adrenaline faded. He had won the battle, but the war felt far from over. The faces in the crowd reminded him of that, faces filled with hope, anger, and something else. Expectation. They wanted more than a statement. They wanted action, results, change. And Malcolm knew he couldn't fail them. Before he could speak, the glass doors opened. Garrett stepped out first, his shoulders squared and his expression carefully neutral, but Malcolm could see the cracks in the captain's composure. Crowley followed, his eyes darting nervously as if he were searching for an escape route. The crowd tensed, phones tilting toward them as if waiting for one wrong move. Malcolm didn't flinch as they approached. He held his ground, letting the silence drag out until Garrett finally spoke. "We need to talk," Garrett said, his voice low but firm. Malcolm didn't move. "We've already talked," he said, his voice steady. "Not here," Garrett replied, glancing toward the crowd. "Inside." Malcolm hesitated. He could feel the weight of the crowd behind him, the unspoken pressure to stand his ground, but he also knew this wasn't the place for what needed to be said next. Without a word, he turned and walked back inside. Garrett and Crowley followed closely, the door closing behind them with a heavy thud that seemed to shut out the outside world. The conference room felt smaller now, the tension thicker. Garrett sat first, leaning forward with his elbows on the table, but Crowley remained standing near the wall, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Malcolm stayed by the door, his posture straight, his eyes sharp. "You've made your point," Garrett started, his tone controlled but edged with frustration. "But this isn't just about you and Crowley anymore. It's bigger than that now. You saw the crowd out there. This is about the department, about the city, about trust, and once that's broken, it's damn near impossible to rebuild." Malcolm's voice cut through the air. "Maybe it should be broken. Maybe that's the only way people will finally see it for what it is." Garrett's eyes flashed. "And what exactly do you think it is?" Malcolm stepped closer. "Rotten," he said. "From the inside out. And if you don't see it, then you're part of the problem." Crowley snapped. "That's enough. You don't know what you're talking about." Malcolm turned to him, his voice cold. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. And so do you." Crowley's face turned red. "I've given everything to this job. I've put my life on the line more times than I can count. And now I'm supposed to let you destroy it all over one mistake." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice sharp. "This isn't about one mistake. It's about a pattern that people like you have been allowed to repeat because no one was willing to stop it. But that ends today." Crowley's voice cracked. "I'm not the villain you're making me out to be." Malcolm didn't back down. "Then prove it," he said. "Not with excuses. Not with apologies. Prove it with actions." Crowley's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Malcolm saw something shift in his eyes. Regret. Fear. Maybe even shame. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Garrett leaned back, exhaling slowly. "You want accountability," he said. "Fine. But be careful what you ask for. You're not just burning Crowley down. You're lighting a match under this entire department." Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. "Then let it burn." Garrett's face hardened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "You're not going to stop, are you?" "No," Malcolm said. Garrett nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Then I guess we'll see how this plays out." He left the room without another word, leaving Malcolm and Crowley alone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavier now, like the air had thickened. Finally, Crowley broke it. "You don't know what it's like," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "To feel like every decision you make could be the one that gets you killed. To walk into situations or you don't know if you're going home at the end of the day. Malcolm's voice softened, but it didn't lose its edge. You're right, he said. I don't know what that's like. But you don't know what it's like to feel like every decision you make could be the one that gets you arrested. Or worse. Crowley's eyes flickered, and Malcolm saw the fight drain out of him. You have a choice, Malcolm said. You can keep making excuses, or you can make this right. But either way, you're going to answer for what you've done. Crowley didn't respond. He just sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands. Malcolm turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a heavy thud. But as he stepped back into the lobby, he knew the real fight hadn't even begun. The crowd was still there, waiting, and the weight of their expectations pressed down on him like never before. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, knowing that the hardest part was still ahead. Malcolm stood just outside the conference room, his back pressed against the cool wall as he tried to steady his breathing. His pulse still pounded in his ears, but it wasn't fear, it was anger, controlled but simmering just beneath the surface. He could still hear Crowley's voice echoing in his mind, the desperation, the defensiveness, the cracks in his confidence. It would have been easy to write Crowley off as nothing more than another arrogant cop trying to save himself, but Malcolm knew it wasn't that simple. He saw the fear in Crowley's eyes, not just fear of losing his badge but fear of losing the identity that badge had given him. And part of Malcolm hated that he understood it. The hallway was quiet, but through the glass windows, Malcolm could see the chaos brewing outside. Reporters still hovered near the steps, their cameras focused on the building like vultures circling prey. Protesters were louder now, their chants echoing off the brick walls, their signs waving above their heads like flags. And in the middle of it all, Malcolm saw faces he recognized, faces of people who had stood in similar positions before, waiting for someone to make things right, hoping that this time, it would be different. The sound of footsteps snapped Malcolm out of his thoughts. He turned to see Garrett approaching, his expression hard and unreadable. There was no hesitation in his stride, but Malcolm could see the tension in his shoulders, the stiffness in the way he carried himself. Garrett stopped a few feet away, folding his arms across his chest as he studied Malcolm for a moment before speaking. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," Garrett said, his voice low but sharp. Malcolm didn't flinch. "It was already stirred," he replied. "I just made sure people started paying attention." Garrett's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You're pushing this too far. Do you even realize what you've started? The department's in chaos, the media's eating this up, and you've got half the city ready to burn the whole system down." Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. "Maybe it needs to burn," he said, his voice steady. "Because this system, it's broken, Garrett. And you know it." Garrett exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't see it every day? But tearing it all down doesn't fix it. It just leaves us with nothing." Malcolm stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Maybe nothing is better than what we have now. Because what we have now, it's a system that protects the wrong people, punishes the wrong people, and lets men like Crowley keep getting away with it. That's not something worth saving." Garrett's eyes flickered, and Malcolm saw the crack in his armor. "You act like it's so simple," Garrett said, his voice quieter now. "Like you can just sweep in and fix decades of damage with one investigation, one press conference, one suspension. But it's not that simple, Malcolm. It's never been that simple." Malcolm's voice softened, but the intensity in his eyes didn't fade. "I know it's not simple. I know it's messy and complicated, and it's going to take more than one investigation to fix it. But I also know that nothing changes if no one's willing to take the first step. And today, that step is holding Crowley accountable." Garrett shook his head, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "And what happens after that? What happens when the protests get bigger, when the media digs deeper, when the department turns against you. Because they will. And you'll be standing out there alone when it happens. Malcolm didn't blink. I won't be alone, he said. Look outside, Garrett. Those people. They're not going anywhere. And neither am I. Garrett looked past him, out the window at the growing crowd. For a moment, Malcolm thought he saw something shift in Garrett's expression, doubt, maybe even regret, but it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. Garrett stepped back, his voice quieter now. You better be ready for what comes next, he said. Because this doesn't end with Crowley. It doesn't end here. Malcolm's eyes stayed locked on his. I know, he said. And I'm ready. Garrett didn't respond. He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the hall until Malcolm was alone again. But the quiet didn't last long. The door to the conference room opened, and Crowley stepped out, his face pale, his eyes dark and hollow. He hesitated when he saw Malcolm, but he didn't turn back. Instead, he walked closer, his steps slower, heavier, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. You win, Crowley said, his voice barely above a whisper. Malcolm didn't move. This was never about winning, he said. Crowley's voice cracked. Then what was it about? Because it sure as hell feels like losing from where I'm standing. Malcolm studied him for a moment before speaking. It's about accountability, he said. It's about finally making things right, even if it's too late to fix the damage that's already been done. Crowley's eyes dropped to the floor. I didn't set out to be this person, he said quietly. I didn't set out to be the bad guy. But you became him, Malcolm said, his voice steady but sharp. And now you have to own that. Crowley swallowed hard, his hands trembling at his sides. What happens now? Malcolm's voice softened just slightly. That depends on you. You can fight this, drag it out, and make it worse. Or you can take responsibility and start doing the work to fix it. Crowley's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Malcolm saw something that almost resembled surrender. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. Crowley looked up, his voice raw. And if I do? If I take responsibility? Does it change anything? Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. Maybe not for you, he said. But it might for someone else. Crowley didn't respond. He just nodded slowly before turning and walking away, his footsteps echoing down the hall until the door closed behind him. Malcolm stayed where he was, his eyes fixed on the empty hallway. The anger was still there, but it was different now, quieter, steadier, focused. He knew the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. But as he turned and walked toward the door that led back outside, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Malcolm stood at the edge of the steps outside the precinct, his shoulders squared as the noise from the crowd swelled again. The flashing lights of the cameras felt brighter now, almost blinding, but he refused to look away. He had faced worse than this before, and he wasn't about to let the weight of the moment shake him. His eyes scanned the sea of faces, some angry, some hopeful, some just curious, and he felt the pressure of their expectations settle on his chest. They were waiting for something, for him to speak, to act, to give them a sign that this fight wasn't over. But before he could say anything, the door behind him opened, and Garrett's voice cut through the noise. We need to finish this conversation, Garrett said, stepping closer, his tone low but urgent. Malcolm didn't turn. We already finished it, he said, keeping his voice steady as he looked straight ahead. Garrett stepped closer, lowering his voice. Not out here. Inside. Now. Malcolm finally turned, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Garrett's. You want to talk? Then say it here. Let them hear it. Or are you afraid of what they'll see? Garrett's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Malcolm thought he was going to back down, but instead, Garrett leaned in closer, his voice dropping even lower. You think this ends with Crowley? You think calling him out fixes this? You don't see the bigger picture, Malcolm. This isn't just about one cop. It's about the system, the politics, the pressure. You're making enemies you can't afford to have. Malcolm's eyes stayed locked on his. I don't care about enemies. I care about accountability. And if that makes me a target, then so be it. Garrett's voice sharpened. You say that now, but what about later? When the cameras are gone and the headlines fade? What happens when they come after you? Malcolm's expression hardened. Then they come after me. But at least I'll know I stood for something. Garrett's face twitched, and for the first time, Malcolm saw something crack beneath the surface. You think I don't get it? Garrett said, his voice shaking slightly. You think I don't know how broken this is? I've been fighting this fight longer than you've been wearing that badge. But you don't fix something like this by tearing it apart piece by piece. You fix it by knowing when to push and when to pull back. And right now? You're pushing too hard. Malcolm stepped closer, his voice low but sharp. No. I'm pushing exactly as hard as I need to. Because people like Crowley have been hiding behind men like you for too long. And I'm done waiting for things to change. Garrett's eyes darkened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he exhaled sharply and stepped back, his shoulders tight. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. Malcolm didn't flinch. Then it's my mistake to make. Garrett turned without another word, disappearing back inside the building. Malcolm stayed where he was for a moment, letting the noise from the crowd wash over him before he stepped down the stairs and into the sea of people. The first reporter reached him almost immediately, shoving a microphone toward his face. Chief Hayes, what happens next? What do you plan to do about Officer Crowley? Malcolm didn't hesitate. Crowley will face disciplinary action, but this isn't just about one officer. This is about accountability at every level. And I won't stop until the people responsible for this culture of abuse are held accountable. The crowd erupted in applause, but Malcolm's eyes remained steady, his focus unshaken. Another reporter pushed forward. What do you say to those who think you're overstepping? That you're letting personal feelings cloud your judgment? Malcolm's voice was sharp. Personal feelings? Let me be clear, this isn't personal. This is systemic. And the fact that so many people are more concerned about my tone than the actions that led to this moment? That's the problem. The murmurs spread through the crowd, but Malcolm didn't stop. This isn't about one bad cop. It's about a system that allows bad cops to thrive. And if people want to call me out for holding that system accountable, then let them. But I'm not backing down. As the reporters shouted more questions, Malcolm's phone buzzed in his pocket. He stepped away from the cameras, signaling for his team to handle the rest as he answered the call. It was Crowley. His voice was quiet, strained. I need to talk to you, Crowley said. Malcolm's jaw tightened. I think we've said enough. No, Crowley said quickly. Not about this. About something else. Malcolm hesitated. What is it? Crowley's voice lowered. I can't talk about it over the phone. But you need to hear this. It's about Garrett. Malcolm's stomach tightened, but he kept his voice steady. Where are you? Crowley paused. Still at the station. But not for long. Meet me in the parking garage. I'll explain everything there. Malcolm ended the call without another word. He didn't trust Crowley, not yet, but something about his voice told him this wasn't just another desperate attempt to save himself. When Malcolm reached the garage, Crowley was already there, pacing near his car. He looked up when he saw Malcolm, his eyes red and his face pale. You're not going to believe me, Crowley said quickly. Try me, Malcolm replied. Crowley swallowed hard. Garrett's been covering for more than just me. There's a whole network, guys on the inside keeping things buried. Complaints, evidence, everything. And Garrett's in the middle of it. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. And you knew about this? Crowley looked down. Not at first. But once I did, I couldn't stop. Garrett made sure of that. Malcolm stepped closer. You're telling me this now? After everything? Crowley's voice cracked. Because I don't have a choice anymore. I'm already finished, but if this comes out. So is he. And so are the rest of them. Malcolm didn't look away. Then you better hope you're telling the truth. Crowley's shoulders slumped. I am. And if you dig deep enough, you'll see it for yourself. Malcolm didn't respond, but he felt the weight of Crowley's words settle over him like a stone. He turned and walked away, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what this meant, and what would come next. Malcolm stood in the dimly lit parking garage, his eyes locked on Crowley's pale face. The weight of everything Crowley had just revealed hung heavy in the air, pressing down on both of them. Malcolm didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch, let Crowley feel the tension building with every passing second. Crowley shifted nervously, his hands trembling as he shoved them into his pockets. You waited until now, Malcolm said finally, his voice low and deliberate, to tell me all of this. After everything you've done. After everything you tried to hide. And now you expect me to believe you? Crowley swallowed hard, his voice cracking. I know I don't deserve that. I know what I did, what I've been a part of, isn't something I can erase. But this isn't just about me anymore. Garrett has been pulling the strings for years, keeping complaints buried, covering for officers like me because it benefited him. I'm telling you this because I can't live with it anymore. Malcolm stepped closer, his eyes sharp. You had plenty of chances to stop this before it got this far. Don't act like you suddenly grew a conscience. You're only here because you're scared. Scared of losing your badge, scared of losing everything that makes you feel important. Crowley's shoulders slumped. You're right. I was scared. But I'm not anymore. I'm done being Garrett's puppet, and if that means going down for what I've done, then so be it. But I'm not going to let him get away with it. Malcolm studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of deception, but all he saw was defeat. Whatever had driven Crowley to this point, Malcolm knew it wasn't courage. It was desperation. But desperation could be useful. If you're serious about this, Malcolm said, his voice steady, then you're going to give me everything. Every name. Every file. Every detail that ties Garrett to this mess. Crowley nodded quickly, his voice trembling. I will. I'll give you everything. But you need to promise me something. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. You're in no position to ask for promises. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Crowley said, his voice breaking. I need to know this means something. That it's not just about taking Garrett down, but about actually fixing this. Malcolm didn't look away. It's never been about taking Garrett down. It's about accountability. For everyone. Including you. Crowley nodded again, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of the truth had finally broken him. Malcolm turned without another word and walked away, his mind already racing through the possibilities of what came next. The investigation unfolded quickly after that. Crowley provided the evidence, hidden files, secret communications, and testimonies that tied Garrett to years of cover-ups and corruption. Garrett's arrest sent shockwaves through the department, shaking its foundation and forcing reforms that had been avoided for far too long. Officers stepped forward, revealing more abuses that had been buried, and the city demanded change. Crowley didn't escape justice. He was stripped of his badge, charged with misconduct, and sentenced to probation and community service. But Malcolm saw something different in him during the sentencing. Crowley didn't fight it. He didn't make excuses. He accepted the consequences, and for the first time, Malcolm wondered if redemption was possible, not just for Crowley, but for the entire system that had enabled him. Garrett's fall was harder. The once respected captain faced criminal charges, and his trial became a national headline. Malcolm testified against him, laying bare the corruption Garrett had worked so hard to conceal. It was a public reckoning, one that exposed not just Garrett's crimes but the culture of silence that had protected him. Garrett's conviction sent a clear message: no one was untouchable. But the fight didn't end there. Malcolm knew the investigation was just the beginning. Policies were rewritten. Officers were retrained. Oversight committees were formed. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for Malcolm, that was enough, for now. Standing outside the courthouse after Garrett's sentencing, Malcolm looked out at the crowd gathered once again. This time, their faces weren't just filled with anger. There was hope, determination, and something Malcolm hadn't seen before: trust. A reporter pushed forward, her microphone raised. "Chief Hayes, what do you say to those who believe this is only the first step? That there's still more work to be done?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "They're right," he said. "This isn't the end. It's the beginning. And I'm not done fighting." As the crowd erupted into applause, Malcolm turned and walked away, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little lighter. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles, more obstacles, and more people like Garrett trying to stop progress. But he also knew he wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The truth is, change doesn't happen overnight. It's messy, uncomfortable, and often painful. But it's necessary. And sometimes, it takes moments like this, moments of confrontation, of accountability, to force that change. So ask yourself, what would you do if you were in Malcolm's shoes? Would you stand up, even when the odds were against you? Would you speak out, even when it meant risking everything? Or would you stay silent, hoping someone else would fight the battle for you? Change isn't just about systems and policies. It's about people. It's about the choices we make every single day to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Let us know what you think in the comments. How did this story make you feel? What lessons do you take from it? And most importantly, what steps do you think we can all take to make sure stories like this don't keep happening? If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful narratives like it, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit the like button to support the channel. Together, we can keep these conversations going and keep fighting for the change we all deserve.